Well, hello there, my friend. It seems you found your way into the shadows. What was it that lured you here anyway? Was it the wailing call of the woman in the dark depths of the wood that was drawing you in? Oh, perhaps it was the rumors of that old, dilapidated home. You know, the one that no one has lived in for quite some time. I hear there's stories of footsteps that still wander through those rooms, and there's lights that flicker in the night. Maybe it was that old school that closed long ago, the one that holds whispers of ages past. I hear apparitions wander those ancient halls. Do you think it's true? Are you seeking that hovering figure? You know, the one that you swear is lurking over your shoulder, just at the corner of your vision. You know it's there, but it always eludes you, hiding in the depths of the darkest crevices of each room. Is it that faint aroma of perfume and cigarette that drifts past you as you step into the warmth of a charming bed and breakfast? That same one that has odd stories of a figure in white, one who gazes at you from mirrors when you least expect it, or tugs at the sheets once you've drifted into sleep. Well, whatever it is that brought you here, my friend, you're welcome. Have a seat with me and pull your blankets close. Hold tight to your flashlight because you might need it. After all, we can't say what's here with us, hidden in the shadows. Welcome back, my somber friends, to another episode. Or is this your first time listening? Please pull up a chair and get as cozy as you're able to. I'm Noelle, and I'll be your narrator this evening. I'm glad you're here to listen to my tales. They're full of abnormal and preternatural phenomenon. Some of these tales are nothing more than that, however. They're just whimsical, mythical anecdotes that are meant to frighten and delight you. And yet, some of these stories are very true and all the more haunting for it. These stories come from friends and family mostly, though I have had encounters as well. I see you're still here, dear friend. Are you ready to delve into the depths of the paranormal with me? Then let's begin. Happy holidays and a merry Yule to all of you. I hope that you've been enjoying the season so far, and I sincerely hope that you enjoyed my last episode. Again, while it wasn't a full episode, it was still a personal story, and every now and then I may do that. In the future, if I decide to open up a Patreon, I will definitely have more personal stories, the more personal kind that I'm not as willing to share whenever it comes to an open area like Spotify or YouTube. I also hope you like my new microphone. I'm afraid that the last one died on me while I was mid-story, and I haven't been able to get it to work since then. In the meantime, I had to use the microphone that is part of my webcam, and that was not a pleasant experience. I have no interest in trying to do that again. So I spent a couple of dollars, $15 at best, and got one of these nice little microphones that you connect to your computer. I only recently released the story, the episode 4.5 as I like to call it, and I immediately got a response from somebody who had more questions about it. I can try to go into detail as much as I can here and there, but again, this is a personal story that has to do with my grandmother, and I'm not as willing to share that type of information or talk about personal family history in a broad spectrum, like YouTube and Spotify, as I said before. The story at best is one that my grandmother spoke with me about a few times. I already knew that my great-grandmother had read tea leaves and that she saw spirits here and there. I also knew that my grandmother was frightened of them. Here and there, I drew bits and pieces from different people, and I was able to piece the stories together. It was a few things that my great-aunt Mildred told me before that really pieced a few things together. And that's all I'm willing to say whenever it comes to that, because there were times that whenever we would talk about this, she would get scared, shaky, antsy, and I never really liked to push her on this. And if you haven't figured it out already, yes, that was me in the story about the church. I don't like reliving that situation whatsoever. I think it was one of the first few times that I saw that shadow. And in fact, speaking of the shadows, I was talking with a friend about his own personal ordeals with shadows. I have a feeling that story is going to come up soon. In the meantime, I do have two particular stories that I've been excited to share. One story in particular I want to thank my brother for because he frightened the hell out of me and my cousins with. This one I call Peavy Road. Never drive on PV Road at night unless you want to see the axe murderer. This was always the warning my cousins and brothers would give each other any time they went down that road. The problem was, this was the only passage from our house to my grandmother's house. She lived 12 miles away, and we often took this road, preferably in the daytime. The road is a winding path that goes deep in the woods. It started out once upon a time as a rutted dirt road well over a century ago. Eventually it was graveled and tarred over, but each time it was such shoddy work, they had no choice but to go out there and reattempt it. However, being out in the county, they didn't really care about keeping it maintained. Those of us who chose to drive down that road, we would have no choice but to go under 15 miles an hour. That way we could avoid potholes, ditches, and random wildlife that were, well, suicidal enough to make that attempt across the road. The trees are thick and they push up against the edge of the pathway. They add to the darkness of the passage no matter what time of day it is. The path through the woods always made me feel uncomfortable. It always felt like something or someone was watching me. That idea seemed ridiculous because there weren't that many houses out there. I would say there were likely 5 or 6 at that time. And most people who decided to live on that road mostly did it because of the fact they had no neighbors. They didn't have to worry about their privacy. In fact, my grandmother's house was one of the few that had been built out there in the early 40s. All the same, I told my brother one day that I had that strange suspicion that something was out there watching us. I wanted him to tell me that it was some random wild animal that was standing off in the distance of the woods, that we couldn't see what the animal was, and that it was watching us, making sure that we didn't mean it or any of the other wild any harm. Unfortunately, that's not what he told me. Instead, he asked, "Oh yeah, you didn't know the story about the man who lived out here?" No, of course I hadn't heard of any man who lived out here. Why would I care about any kind of story like that? My brother explained, "Well, the man who lived out here killed his wife and children. It was back in the early 1900s. Are you sure I never told you that story?" And just like that, the sensation that we were being watched intensified tenfold. Knowing that my brother likes to tease and likes to play pranks on me and my siblings, I anticipated that he was pulling my leg. But I could usually tell whenever he was in a playful mood. He would always get this smirk on his face, like he knew he was pulling one on you and was waiting for you to catch up to the joke. This time he didn't have that look on his face. This time there was a confused type of terror. Again he said, "Well, it was back in the early 1900s. This man and his wife moved down this way from Tennessee, or maybe it was further north, I'm not really sure. Anyway, they wanted to move to Texas so they could build a farm out this way. There weren't any neighbors that were close, maybe 10 miles, probably further than that. The story is that the man and his wife, they were successful in building a home, but there was so much lumber out this way he had to chop everything down before he could even begin his farm. The solitude apparently got to him. He kept hearing voices and was claiming that he heard spirits out in the woods taunting him. They lived out here for maybe 10 years before he finally just lost it and grabbed his axe and went after his wife and children. No one even had an idea that he'd killed them for months. Finally, they found out whenever he went into town with blood all over him. They said that he was ranting and raving and going insane, yelling about how the ghosts had made him kill his own family. The story is he even took a few of the city people out before they were able to get a hold of the sheriff, and the sheriff was supposedly able to stop him by shooting his leg, or maybe it was his arm. I'm not really sure. But they finally got him in the jail cell, and all he did then was just stare through the window at the sky and scream at it over and over again. People went out there to his house to see just how bad the damage was. They said it was so horrific that it was about this time my brother perhaps realized that he was talking to a 10-year-old, and I didn't need to know what exactly happened to the bodies. Instead, my brother concluded, "People still say he's out here, you know. They say that you can still hear him screaming up at the sky in rage, still trying to find the spirits and stop them from taking his family that he killed. Or they'll say that they hear him chopping down the wood because he's still trying to build his farm out here, and he'll chase anybody who trespasses." Some people who hunt out here have even said they've had a burning sensation on their back or they felt like something blunt hit them. Sometimes they even say that there's a burning sensation on their wrist or arm all the way through. I remember one of my friends who came out here had scratches along his neck and chest and back. There were even some red rings along his arm like something had hit him. The whole idea of seeing some psychotic ghost was terrifying enough, but I had to ask my brother, "Have you ever seen the ghost?" That confused expression, somewhere between unease and discomfort, came across his face as he answered, "Well, I didn't see anything, but..." He explained that he and my cousins, when they were teenagers, would go hunting out in this area. Since the woods were so dense and the population was scarce here, it was easy for them to set up camp for 3 or 4 days and just stay out here. When deer season was open, it was pretty common for them to set up camp so they could hopefully bag a buck or two. They would come out early afternoon to set up their tents, and then they would set up a temporary fire so they could heat up their cans of dinty stew and chicken and dumplings. They would talk about their plans to wake up early the next day. They would have their trees already selected and prepared, and then they would go to bed early so they could get up even earlier the next morning and get ready to hunt. Well, one night, apparently, something woke them up and sent them all running. As they had countless times before, they bunked down early, around 8 o'clock, only to be woken up a few hours later by a loud, blood-curdling scream. In East Texas woods, most people would assume it was a wild animal, except my brother told me this didn't sound like some prowling animal. The scream was long and angry, and it had the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The 4 boys grabbed their weapons and lights, they climbed out of the tent, and they saw nothing. The 4 of them stood there for a few minutes, flashing the lights around while the screams dissipated. Whenever they felt they were safe enough, they began to climb back into their tent, but the screams came again, louder and closer. Immediately they climbed back out with their flashlights, flashing them around to see if there was a wild animal nearby that they had missed. However, there was another scream. It came louder and angrier, and there was a decided thunk that sounded like an axe striking wood right beside my cousin's head. My brother looked pale as he told me. We didn't even bother to get our belongings together. By this point, we were so freaked out we opted to take our guns and lights and leave the tent behind for the night. The plan was for us to come back the next day to get what we'd left behind. As the 4 of them scrambled through the woods, hurrying back to the truck, my brother swore he heard something rushing behind him. He said that it sounded like some raving lunatic, slobbering, grumbling, grunting, the way a lunatic would if they were chasing after somebody. My brother said that he didn't want to tell the others what he'd heard, but whenever they got back to Granny's house, they all heard the same thing. He said it was our eldest cousin Mike who said it first, that there had been somebody growling and grunting at him like an angry drunk guy. All of the other cousins agreed at that while they hadn't seen anything, each of them had heard something chasing after them. Something that made them feel completely unsafe, like they were being hunted themselves. The next morning when they all went after their tent, my brother said they found deep grooves on the trees around the camp. Like somebody had an axe and they had made those grooves intentionally. The 4 of them were quick to get the tent and everything else packed up because they said it felt like something was watching them the whole time. And my brother swore he would never go back out to that part of the woods. He did say he did try to find out if there had been an axe-wielding madman who lived out in the area, and he said he did come across a story that may have been the actual axe-wielding man that lived in the area. The story he came across was back from the 1920s. There had been a man who lived in the area who was arrested after he slaughtered his whole family and neighbors. He apparently had been in a drunken fit, and the man was known for his temper. The news article said that he was even thought to be crazy because he was screaming about the ghosts that lived out in the woods. My brother didn't find any further information, but he said it did make him wonder, was this the man who haunted the Peavy Woods? And was this a spirit whom they'd all felt that night watching them? If so, how many other people could claim feeling that unwelcome spirit? Or was my brother making all this up to scare me? He looked at me after telling me this whole story to say, "Never drive on Peavy Road at night." And while I promised him that I never would, let's just say I broke that promise. I was 16 at the time and had just gotten my driver's license, and my boyfriend Tommy was with me. It was my first time to be driving along this road at 10 miles an hour. At first, I had forgotten all about the creepy tales that my brother had told me ages ago. But the further along this road that I went, the stronger that sensation of being watched increased. Tommy had it in his mind that we should stop somewhere and maybe get a little cuddly with each other, but I wasn't having it. I just had the sensation of something out there in the woods. As we went around this particular sharp corner, I suddenly saw a flash of white out in the woods and almost came to a stop. I've never been struck by fear so strongly before, but at that moment I had been. I told my boyfriend to hold on as tight as he could because I was going to speed up. He told me, "Don't. You're just going to wreck your car," but I didn't care. I wanted out of this woods as quick as I could. I dared to go as high up as 25 miles an hour, and I'm glad that nobody was driving along that road because they likely would have struck me as fast as I was going. I was taking each turn as sharp as I was able, and by the time I got to my grandmother's house, I was a shaken mess. Have I been down that road since then? Oh, most certainly. But I have never driven on it in the evening time when I know something might be out there watching me. I have no interest in seeing what that white flash could have been. I have no interest in hearing the mad, slobbering screams of a madman, and I most certainly do not want to feel the sting of an axe swinging at my back or through my hands or wrist or anywhere else, and I do not want to get scratched up by whatever that might be. If there are others who have experienced PV Road, then they have my sympathy. I've heard that more people have built their houses out there, so maybe the grip of the madman that lived out there has decreased. I couldn't say. After my grandmother's passing, I lost all interest in going down that road or anywhere near the area, and the people I used to know out that way, they have moved on as well. I have young cousins that have moved out into that area, and they are of driving age. And since they are at that age, I make sure to warn them, never drive on PV Road at night unless you want to see the axe murderer. Our next story is titled, "I Don't Feel as Welcome in This House as I Should Be." The house on Ann Street was built up on a small hill in the early 1960s. It was built in a quiet little community that had just begun to form. It started as a 2-bedroom, 1-bath building with a 1-car garage attached to the side of the house. An expansive backyard of 2 acres was attached to it, and it was a lovely starter home for a young family. Over time, it was expanded on. The backyard was fenced in, and a gazebo was constructed, along with a lovely garden sometime in the 80s. In the 90s, somebody had the foresight to brick in the garage to make it a large family room. They added carpeting and dark pine paneling. They walled off a closet with dual doors for storage purposes. In the early 2000s, the family who lived there added a 2-vehicle carport to the front. They signed their names in the concrete that they'd laid, forever marking their addition to the home. Somewhere between that time and the 2009s, it went up on market and eventually became mine. When my husband and I moved into that house on Ann Street, the outside paneling was a burnt orange tone with sandstone brick. It had a glass screen door and a dull red front door that was coming off its hinges. The gardens in the back had died over the years, and the front yard had a tree with a decidedly dangerous slant to it. The bathroom definitely needed updating from its lavender and lime wall tiles, and that tub, it needed replacing. The kitchen was odd tones of brown and orange speckles with sage. It was ugly, but it was affordable. When we moved into that house, all we saw at first were the large windows in the living room. With the massive front window letting in all that sunshine, we knew that we wouldn't spend any time in the front room until the evening anyway. Most of our time would be spent in the office, which we decided to make out of the smallest bedroom in the far back of the house. It was cuddled up against the lone bathroom, and it was an odd setup, but it would work well enough for us. As for that large family room, since it was so spacious, we decided that would act as our main bedroom. For some reason, the temperature in that room was cooler, which meant it would be perfect for us. I never really noticed anything odd about the house at first. If my husband noticed anything, he never mentioned it. I figure he would have, since he worked from home at that time. All we knew is that for the first few months we were really happy. Our dogs had more space to run around. They had a spacious backyard. And while it was true there was a funeral home a couple of acres away that we could see, there was a cluster of trees that kept us from really seeing the building, and I never got a creepy sensation from seeing it anyway. It just looked like a brick building that could have been a bank once upon a time. Besides, I had plans for the gardens. I was going to add a few more trees to blockade that area, give us a little bit more privacy, and rehabilitate that poor gazebo that had been falling over time. As I said, I didn't notice anything for the first few months until I started having the dreams. The first dream occurred about 5 to 6 months after we moved in. It was a brief flash, a man hanging from the rafters of what used to be the garage that was now our bedroom. I could make out the drab gray colored wood against the sandstone. Then there was a rough creak of rope against upper rafters. My vision shifted upward, and there he was. His face was a mottled purple topped by scruffy brown hair and a thick matted beard that covered the lower half of his jaw. His eyes were a furious brown glare that were ringed by red. The creaking stopped as he became still in his movement, head slanting at an irregular angle and those eyes fixed on me. I woke up with an abrupt start and stared at the ceiling. The rafters had been covered with thick foam squares, but I knew without seeing them that those same rafters were still there. These were the rafters that he'd hung from, right above my bed. In a matter of seconds, I went from horror and realization to placating myself by saying, "It was just a dream. Just a dream. You're being silly." It took a lot of effort to lull myself back to sleep that night. My dreams did take awkward turns from there, and I would sometimes dream about the man hanging from the rafters. One night, it changed on me. The man was hanging from the rafters, and then he wasn't. He was hovering there against the edge of the bed watching me, with those same furious brown eyes and that thick scruffy hair jutting frantically from his head. He moved toward me, leaning over and staring into my face with open malice. His mouth stretched wide, and a scream started to build up low in his chest, rumbling upward. As it hit a high pitch, I woke up, screaming myself. My arms flailed out as I attempted to get away from the man that was no longer there. As I thrashed and kicked my way across the bed, I knocked into my husband and forced him awake. He had to grab my arms to keep me from striking him. Still half asleep, he demanded to know, "What is wrong with you? What is going on?" And I, in tears, told him about the dream, about the man who had hovered along the edge of the bed, who was getting ready to strangle me. Clearly, my husband didn't believe me. He didn't even believe me about the dreams about the man hanging from the rafters. Still, I tried to explain what I had seen, and he told me again and again, "It was just a dream. You need to calm down. You need to go back to sleep." But as I repeatedly explained that no, this was not a dream, it felt too real, he got so angry with me that he decided, "I've had enough of this, and I have work in the morning. You have fun sleeping with your ghost, but I'm going to sleep on the couch." Needless to say, that night was a sleepless night. That was also the first night I let my dogs in to sleep in the bed with me. It wasn't long after these new sets of dreams began that my brother-in-law moved back into town and began to come over frequently. It struck me with great unease how much he looked like the man in my dreams. Tall and gangly, with scruffy brown hair and dark brown eyes that sometimes looked mean. He even had a tangled brown beard that he never bothered with. Over time, my neighbors got used to seeing my brother-in-law swing by at least a few times a week. With no car and no job, we were often his mode of transportation. It so happened that he found himself a job one state over and asked my husband and I to take him there to the next state. Since it was only a couple of hours away, we agreed to this. And that evening, whenever we got home, my neighbor across the street came by to say, "Oh, I'm so glad you're home. I didn't know that you had given a key to your brother-in-law." At first, I assumed she meant my sister's husband, whom I rarely saw. "What would Gary be doing coming by the house?" I asked her. She said, "No, I don't mean Gary. I meant Tony. I saw him come by the house earlier and walk in, so I assumed he had a key, but whenever I went by to tell him that you guys weren't home, he never came to the door." I was frantic at the idea of somebody breaking into our house and rushed inside without thought to check on our dogs. My husband was yelling at me to stay outside while he called the police, but I would have none of that. I searched the house high and low for any indication of a break-in, but there was nothing. No signs of anything being taken, no signs of damage to any of the windows or doors. There was no sign of anybody outside of my dogs having been there. The police came, they searched, and they went with promises that they would drive by later on. But I knew already that there was no need for them to even come back because whatever was there was no longer living. And whenever I shared this thought with my husband, he accused me of just letting my fears get the best of me. Maybe his saying that is what led that spirit to do what it did to him. Or maybe it was simply tired of him not believing in it. It was late at night whenever my husband began to yell, pointing at the corner of the room. Even my dogs, which were often calm, were shivering and curling up against us in terror. After my husband had calmed down enough, he explained that he had seen something in the corner of the room over by the closet. He said whatever it had been had moved away from the corner toward him and then angled toward the foot of the bed to stare at him. My dogs had woken up and begun to growl at whoever it was. My husband said that the thing, or human, whatever it was, had stretched a hand out in his direction, leaning toward him in a very threatening manner, and it had whispered his name. That had been more than enough for my husband. He grabbed his pillow and threw it at the figure, who immediately disappeared whenever the pillow went through it. And that's whenever my husband began to yell and try to wake me up. I did research on the house, but I never found anything. I asked my neighbors about the house and if anybody had died in there, and they knew nothing. But I can guess what happened. It wasn't long after that my husband and I decided we wanted to get rid of the carpet in our bedroom. So we dismantled all of the furniture to pull it out and began the long, tedious task of getting all of the carpet up bit by bit. As we got to the area of carpet where the bed had been, we found an odd brown stain spread out over the concrete. We had intended to stain the concrete, but the idea of seeing that strange brown stain just sickened us. We decided instead to cover it up. That same night that we revealed that brown stain was the same night that something or somebody decided to rattle the bedroom door frantically. My husband had the idea that either his brother was playing a prank on us or somebody had gotten into the house and yelled at them that he was going to tear into them if they didn't leave. The rattling stopped, but then was replaced with loud pounding knocks at the front door. We hurried into the living room to see what was going on, both of us terrified out of our minds. The knocking stopped immediately, and the doorknob began to shake back and forth. When I glanced out the large window outside, I saw nobody on the front porch. And yet that doorknob was still shaking and rattling. Even more terrifying was the realization that the glass hurricane door that was in front of the front door was still closed and locked. It wasn't very long after that we decided to move to another house. I heard that someone moved into that home shortly after we left and promptly moved back out. Did they have the same run-in that we did with that same spirit? I don't know. I never asked them. And I'm still tempted to do research on that house to see if somebody died in there. At the same time, I'm terrified to know. I may not live there anymore, but I feel like finding that information out might just open a door that I don't want to open. Besides, I have a feeling that something else that had been in that house did follow me to the new place. And that's more than enough for me to deal with at this point. Well then, my lovely listeners, that wraps it up for this episode of Men and Madness. Tell me, which story do you think is real? Funnily enough, if you've known me for a long time, then you probably already know. However, there are still a lot of stories that I haven't shared that most people would be completely astonished by. I do intend to do a Christmas episode fairly soon. I'm still writing it at this moment, and yes, it is going to be another true story. If you're listening to me on Spotify, please give me a rating, or if you're listening to me on YouTube, Please like, follow, give me a comment. I do enjoy them. I also love to hear other people's stories, so please go over to our Facebook group, Hidden in the Shadows, a paranormal podcast. Apparently, there was another In the Shadows paranormal podcast that took great umbrage to me using the same title. But don't worry, I will also have the link in the description. In the future, I am likely going to open my microphone to recording other people's stories if I can get enough people to do so. Hearing myself tell the stories is spooky enough, but to hear it from other people's point of view can be even more frightening. But that's further down the road, so I won't worry so much about that. What I will worry about are the shadows that are hovering close. It's getting dark, my dear friends. Be sure that you've grabbed your blankets and you are cuddled up as tight as you can. And in the meantime, good night, sleep tight, and don't let the ghouls bite.